From the Toronto Star, I'm Sabah Itazaz, and this matters. We need to talk about a diversity problem, one that might be in places aiming to help fix the problem. I've been hearing it from friends in the nonprofit field for years. Nonprofit leadership isn't very diverse. Nonprofit boardrooms aren't very diverse. Nonprofits don't know where to find BIPOC leadership, or gay people, or those who are differently abled. You get the picture. Well, it seems the data also supports that, and the numbers don't lie. A Stats Canada survey has revealed that there's a diversity deficit in the boardrooms of Canada's not-for-profit sector, even though government funding and public donations are the main source of revenue. In today's episode, we will take a look at an important question. If a sector that is dedicated to addressing society's most pressing problems cannot tackle the conversations about race, equity, diversity, and inclusion, then which sector can? Later in the show, we will be joined by star reporter Nicholas Keung to talk numbers and what they're showing. But first, let's hear about lived experience from someone who actually works there. Soofia Mahmood is currently the chief of staff at Raising the Village, a predominantly BIPOC nonprofit. She's an immigrant from Pakistan with almost 2 decades of experience working in local and international nonprofit organizations. Hi, Sophia. Thanks so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me, Sabah.
Sophia, talk to me about your experience as a POC in the nonprofit sector. How has it been?
It has been colorful, to say the least, especially in the context of my own reality as an immigrant. And of course, the experience has been varied over the years based on my own levels of vulnerability, my own levels of privilege. I mean, today I'm working in a senior executive position in a nonprofit organization among 100% BIPOC leadership team. And that's an extremely privileged position to be in. But it was different 5 years ago when I immigrated from Pakistan. It was a very different experience at that time. I was at a vulnerable level at that time. I was not seeking frontline work within the sector, which is where you see the most diversity. But instead, I was this kick-ass communications pro with an accent and years of leadership experience, but just not in Canada. So I was trying to get my foot in the door, resettle myself, make a mark within management. And it was challenging being a racialized immigrant woman at the time, even within the nonprofit sector. It's a myth, I think, that those who work for equity have it all figured out, and then there would be no issues, no racism, no discrimination there. But there is interpersonal, there is systemic, for sure.
So can you give me some examples of that, what you observed and what you experienced during your time in the nonprofit sector in the beginning, as you say?
Yeah, in my first few years, I was applying to many jobs to get my foot in the door and then, to grow and find work that I'm actually qualified for. And so I gave many interviews. And I can say, if I look back, I can say with a lot of confidence that 95% of my interview panels were not people of color. And that's quite a reflection of the imbalance of power, decision-making power within that sector. As a newcomer, you face a lot of barriers to employment. But on top of that, what I want to talk about is the way you're objectified as a newcomer. That adds another layer of complexity. I remember through my own interview processes how objectified I felt at the time, and it hits you hard in that context. And I'm not talking about getting the job or not. I'm talking about the human interaction, that comes about through the entire recruitment process and the feedback process, how you're treated and how that reflects the individual biases that feed to the larger systemic problem.
And what sort of interactions have you had, for instance? Does anything come to mind sharply?
Yeah, sure. I have a few stories for you. I remember this one interviewer, she kept calling me so unique, and she kept repeating how unique I was. I'm so glad she didn't call me exotic, but you know what I mean. And then another time when I had applied for a senior leadership position and went through the entire process, the hiring manager personally called me to decline, which was very, very thoughtful. But the conversation went something like this. Sophia, it's so great to have people like you apply for positions like these. We need more diversity in leadership positions. And you're so great and your experiences are so relevant, but only if they were in Canada. And then she said something. She said, my heart breaks for you. And I wondered what she's talking about. It was a job interview. Only my professional journey was discussed. Why is her heart breaking for me? And I realized how hard it is to break stereotypes that are so pervasive. How you're exoticized and objectified as a newcomer and how you become a sob story before you even tell people you're a sob story. So yeah, these are some of the experiences that reflect those personal biases. And Sabah, even when I got my foot in the door and I was working, I had some very interesting experiences. I had a conversation with a colleague who told me that there are just too many people of color within the sector and how that's reverse racism. I remember a colleague who insisted on often calling me by another coworker's name who had the same shade of skin as mine, right? Because all of us look alike, I guess. And I remember this one time one coworker didn't agree with my opinions in a strategy discussion. And they said, "This is Canada, Sophia. It's not Pakistan." And then, the microaggressions, like the backhanded compliments. "Oh, you're from Pakistan, but you're so nice. Oh, you're from Pakistan, but your accent isn't so bad." So, my point is that the human condition prevails, and within this sector, and especially within this sector, because we serve marginalized communities, there needs to be a lot of self-reflection on an individual level as well. It's not just, an organizational or a systemic responsibility. It's on every individual working in that sector, including myself, who needs to continue self-reflecting and challenging our own biases, because it's so important in the kind of work we do.
We'll be right back. Sophia, all of this that you're telling me, is this because of the disconnect that is there because of a lack of inclusivity and diversity, true inclusivity and diversity in leadership positions or in the boardrooms in the nonprofit sector or in charities? And now that you've made it into a leadership position in that sector, what does it feel like often being the only person of color in that room, if that is the case? And also, what are the consequences of this on ground if this is an actual problem?
Yeah, you understand that, even this sector, it's sort of a microcosm of the society we live in. There are just too many of us, people of color, but not enough in senior positions and decision-making powerful positions. So yeah, that's certainly the case in this sector as well. Over the years, as I learned to navigate and I grew in my own career, I realized how problematic it is that there just aren't enough BIPOC leaders. I remember going to fundraising, networking events where I was, one of the 5 people of color in a room of 100. In fact, I went to a panel discussion in which they were discussing how South Asians and Asians are going to impact the results of the election. And, we were talking about civic engagement. I was the only South Asian in that room of 200 people. So yeah, you often find yourself in these situations and it could get uncomfortable at the very least, but it's definitely a bigger conversation. And even when there is change happening, Sabha, in the context of the recent reckonings happening all around us, and people are really trying to improve representation, even on the senior leadership level, which is great. But I find it's often so reactionary and performative and more motivated by political correctness. I would question that even if people of color get to that table, do they have the decision-making power? Or are they just expected to be, good workers, but extremely grateful and agreeable all the time? And so there remains that imbalance of power. As I mentioned, I'm one of the lucky few. 3% of racialized immigrant women, according to research done in 2019, make it to executive positions in nonprofit and public sectors in the GTA. I made it. And I'm in a position where I don't feel like I'm risking my career talking about this very, very important issue, to have these uncomfortable conversations, but meaningful dialogue. But often a lot of people of color in senior positions are not in that safe space to be able to have these dialogues. And so, it keeps perpetuating. And so my question is, who is making those decisions? Who's driving that narrative of equity in this country? Senior leadership that is empowered to make decisions, and not often people of color. And so who's making those decisions where the funds would go? Who's telling the stories of the most marginalized and vulnerable people they serve, who are often overrepresented by people of color? And so, yeah, that has deep consequences because it is unknowingly or knowingly perpetuating the very oppression that this sector is fighting. And so it's good to have these dialogues and it's good to, make real change.
These are very good points, Sophia. I just want to clarify. So you were the only South Asian in an event for South Asians? Is that what you were telling me earlier?
No, it wasn't an event for South Asians. It was a panel discussion with political analysts and journalists talking about how South Asian and Asian communities, just by their sheer number, might influence the vote. And so we were discussing civic engagement and communication efforts and strategies that should be happening to engage those communities. So it was more of a political discussion, a civic engagement discussion. But yeah, it was very ironic that, they were discussing how South Asians and Asians are going to influence the election. And in the audience of that panel discussion, at least visibly, as much as I could see, I was the only South Asian. And I did give this feedback later to the event organizers, and they took it well.
Well, I can't say that I haven't been there, Sophia, so I feel you on that one. Thank you so much for your time and your insight.
Thank you for having me, Sama.
Stay safe.
You too.
That was Soofia Mahmood from Raising the Village. Star reporter Nicholas Keung joins me now to talk about how the data led to the discovery of a diversity problem. Hi, Nicholas.
Hi, thanks for having me again, Saber.
So it seems it's not just anecdotal. The data reflects that there might be a diversity problem in the Canadian nonprofit sector. What picture are the numbers painting right now?
Yes, it turns out not only the corporate boards have a diversity problem. I think many people actually expected the not-for-profit sector would look a little bit different, and this came as a surprise. According to Statistics Canada, other than the representation of women, a lot of work still needs to be done. And for example, of the 6,000 plus people who sat on these boards and responded to the survey, only 14% identified themselves as immigrants, and 11%, as visible minorities, 8% as LGBTQ+, and 6% as persons with a disability, and just 3% as First Nations, Métis, or Inuit.
Right. And meanwhile, their main source of revenue is Canadians and the government, right? And the internal leadership, it seems like, it does not seem to reflect what Canada looks like now.
I think there's definitely an argument to be made from the public good perspective, especially when the key funding source of the not-for-profit and charitable sector comes from government, foundations, and donations. That's why people expect more from the sector when it comes to diversity, representation, and inclusion in their leadership, which has a huge impact on important decisions being made and policy setting. And you've seen the number of board representations in the sector by far is nowhere close to the Canadian population, where 22% of Canadians are immigrants, 19% are visible minorities, 22% have one or more disabilities, and 5% as First Nations, Métis, or Inuits. And I think, there's just a gross underrepresentation there.
And this is interesting since many of these nonprofits and charities actually work to address the social political needs of the disenfranchised, marginalized, and racialized groups. And yet we see so few of them in the rooms where the decisions are made. Do any of these nonprofits have any clear policy on diversity and representation? And also tell me a little bit more about the work that these organizations that were included in the survey, the work that they do.
Yeah, according to the survey, shockingly, only 42% of the almost 9,000 respondents reported that their organization actually has a written policy on board diversity. And these are like local, community, provincial, national, and even international organizations that offer social services, that engage in arts and culture, sports and recreation, education and research, and health research. So actually about 72% of the participants actually reported that their organizations serves at least two of these designated population groups, and 64% reported that their organization serves at least three of them. So how could they so underrepresented, in their leadership? I think that begs a lot of questions.
Mm-hmm. And we didn't have a lot of race-based data on this before, as we've realized during this pandemic that we lack in so many other sectors as well. How did these numbers finally come about?
This is actually groundbreaking stuff. The collection of race-based data is a double-edged sword. It's all based on the intent of the researchers and how the data is going to be used. And it didn't happen by fluke. So last summer, in the wake of the racial reckoning in North America and around the world in the middle of a global pandemic, Ontario Senator Ratna Omidvar wrote an open letter in the Philanthropist magazine challenging the sector to start collecting demographic data on its own. So Statistics Canada read this letter and offered to develop a way to collect the data. So the Senator's office, along with other charitable organizations from Imagine Canada, Ontario Nonprofit Network, the YMCA, Circle on Philanthropy, and Aboriginal Peoples, They all come together and work together with Statistics Canada to conduct a survey of the sector through their own crowdsourcing network. And this is the outcome of that collaboration.
Right. And what do the advocates say about why it's important to have inclusivity and representation at the board level for these organizations?
As we know, like in our society and in most organizations, decisions are made top down, mostly. Without a seat at the table, it's harder for the underrepresented groups' voices to get heard. Boards set policies, they create corporate culture, they decide how resources are going to be allocated, and are responsible for delivering these programs and services to ensure they are inclusive and equitable. Advocates, including the senator, are all saying we need to hold the leadership of these organizations accountable. And the first step is to establish benchmark through data like this to move forward. It's important for the sector to look at governance through a diversity lens. Right now, the federal government already has a federal reporting system that requires federal corporations to disclose demographic diversity in their governance. What they're suggesting is for the charitable and not-for-profit sector to do the same. In order to register and renew their status, they need to provide that information. The Senate actually has already recommended that the CRA, the Canada Revenue Agency, to include questions on their tax forms on diversity representation on boards of directors as per the existing employment equity definitions. So based on clear evidence, the country and the sector to see if progress is being made, how and where. And that should give a very good first step, to create change.
Thank you so much for sharing those numbers, data, and your insight with us, Nicholas.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be on your show.
I was speaking to Star reporter Nicholas Keung. He writes about immigration, refugee, and diversity issues. That's it for today. Thanks so much for listening. This Matters is hosted and produced by me, Sabai Tazaz, Adrian Chung, and Raju Mutter. Produced and mixed by Sean Pattenden, and our director of programming is JP Fozo. Our show theme music is by So-Called, and our episode music is by Mike DeAngelis. We want to hear what stories matter to you. Please send us comments, questions, or ideas to thismatters@thestar.ca. Please consider supporting the journalism the Toronto Star newsroom does at thestar.com. And don't forget to subscribe to This Matters on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Let's talk soon.